April 1944, Rudolf Vrba, who was then just 19 years old, escaped from Auschwitz along with Alfred Wetzler, who was about 5 or 6 years older than him. And they did it with an amazing act of ingenuity. They were brilliant enough to have spotted a gap in the Nazi defenses, not a literal physical gap, but a kind of loophole. And that way they were able to do something that almost no one had ever done before as Jewish prisoners, and that was to escape from Auschwitz. Their purpose was not just to save their own lives, but because they wanted to warn the world, and particularly warn the Jews of Europe what going to Auschwitz meant. Rudi Vrba himself, even when he was just a teenager in Auschwitz, understood that the whole of the Nazi method rested on the ignorance of the victims. For the Nazis' plan to kill the Jews of Europe to work, they needed the Jews of Europe to be ignorant of what fate awaited them at the end of the railway tracks. And so Rudi realized the one way, potentially, to slow down the Nazi killing machine was to tell the Jews of the world what fate was lying in store for them in Auschwitz. Auschwitz was, by the time of the early 1940s, a vast, sprawling, almost city in its size. Tens of thousands of prisoners, these vast buildings, gas chambers and crematoria. It was a big, sprawling metropolis of death, as one survivor called it. And Rudi Vrba was there for nearly 2 years. He got to know every corner of this vast place and began to see how it might be possible to work out an escape. The only thing he didn't know for certain is where exactly he was, because they had been led there by a mysterious route, and it was only his own brain power that made him able to work out exactly where Auschwitz-Birkenau was in the world. And he did that because as part of his job, when he was handling the possessions of Jews who had been taken to Auschwitz, he found a child's atlas, and he looked at a page of the atlas and worked out exactly where on the map Auschwitz was. And he had that route in his mind. So when he and Alfred Wetzler escaped, they had, as Rudi put it, no map, no compass, no friends on the outside to help them. Except in his head, he had a mental map of the route away from Auschwitz along the route of the river Shoah, which would take him about 90 to 100 kilometers to the border of southern Poland and Slovakia, his home country. And that was his destination. This book, The Escape Artist, because Rudi Vrba never stopped escaping. In some ways, he was always on the run, even after he'd escaped Auschwitz and after the war. He went to one country, then escaped from there. He escaped even from his first marriage, then his own name. He was somebody who was always, in some ways, escaping. And partly that's because it's so hard to escape the shadow of Auschwitz that loomed over his life. He had escaped from Auschwitz in order to tell the world what was happening. And he carried on doing that for the rest of his life. And he would say afterwards that he was not your usual Holocaust survivor, because a lot of Holocaust survivors, we expect them to be full of wisdom and words of consolation and comfort. And he instead was angry. And therefore he was often not a comfortable figure to be around. He could be quite difficult. His first wife told me that he had been very damaged by what he had gone through. Of course he had. But that doesn't detract from the extraordinary life he had lived and the extraordinary thing he had done. One One reason I wanted to tell this story is it seemed to me wrong that many people had forgotten what Rudi Vrba had achieved. By getting the word out, he triggered a series of diplomatic moves involving the Pope and the President of the United States, Franklin Roosevelt, that eventually led to the saving of 200,000 Jews, 200,000 lives of the Jews of Budapest in Hungary. They were not deported to Auschwitz as a result of what Rudi Vrba, along with Fred Wetzler, achieved, which is why I say his story belongs alongside Oskar Schindler, Anne Frank, or Primo Levi, those people whose stories define our understanding of the Holocaust. To me, he is one of the great heroes, towering figures of the entire wartime period, which is why I hope his story is remembered and he performs one last act of escape and escapes our forgetfulness.